How to install WeatherTRAK FlowLink. The WeatherTRAK FlowLink is a flow solution that helps us retrofit flow features onto existing irrigation systems by using the existing wires or the irrigation infrastructure that's already in the ground. The FlowLink is designed to speed up the installation by eliminating some of that expensive trenching that can happen on a site, and in doing so, save the installer and the customer time and money. The reason we call the FlowLink a retrofit solution is when you're installing a new irrigation system out on your site after they build the building, they'll add a water meter and likely a backflow. You'll have your controller and a wide open space where you can dig a big trench and you can add all of your valves and throw the wires for those valves inside that trench. At that time, if you're installing a flow sensor, you can add the very specific shielded wire that it takes to manage that flow sensor. However, on an existing site, they've already built that out, so that wide open space has now been filled with parking lots and hardscapes and things that make it very difficult to trench. So if you want to add a flow sensor, but you've got a parking lot in the way, that trench becomes very difficult, easily doubling, tripling, or more the cost of the installation of that flow sensor. So trenching across this parking lot makes this project not cost effective. That's where the FlowLink comes in. What the FlowLink is going to do is use the wires on those existing field stations and pick those up where they leave off at the valve. Then you'll just have to install your new flow sensor and trench from where the existing valve wire stops over to where you want to install your flow sensor and master valve. And by eliminating trenching across the parking lot, we can significantly reduce the installation cost of the flow sensor. In this recording, we're going to discuss two separate installation scenarios. In the first example, we'll discuss a system without a pre-existing master valve, or a system that doesn't have a master valve in place before we get started. And in the second example, we'll discuss how an existing master valve changes the installation scenario. In our first example, we'll be describing a scenario for a system without a pre-existing master valve. For this application, we'll be using the FlowLink XT Plus. The XT Plus is made up of three components: a CT or controller transceiver, the FXT, and the EXT. In this training, we'll describe where each component goes and how to wire it into the system. Also, for your reference, there's a great wiring diagram in the WeatherTRAK Flow Solutions Guide. If you haven't seen the WeatherTRAK Flow Solutions Guide, download it today and look up the wiring diagram. It looks like this and does a great job describing the process of installing the FlowLink. In this diagram, you see the CT or controller transceiver installed at the controller, and then the wire running out to the field underneath the asphalt to the valve that we're going to intercept. At that valve location, you see the EXT installed on the valve wires we intercept from the controller. It's important that the EXT be installed no more than 4,000 feet away from the CT. Then we see a trench to the FXT where we install our flow sensor and master valve at our system's point of connection. If, however, you are installing on a system that does have a pre-existing master valve, then you're lucky because you already have a designated wire path that goes exactly to the place where we're going to install the master valve and flow sensor. In this case, we'll need the FlowLink XT, not the XT Plus. You'll notice that the FlowLink XT has the controller transceiver, or the CT, and the FXT, but not the EXT that helps borrow the wires from another valve. This is because we already have the wires running to the right place. Again, if you look in the Flow Solutions Guide, you'll see a great wiring diagram that highlights that the CT or controller transceiver is installed at the controller. Then we have our wires that run under the asphalt or other obstructions out to the field. And in this case, they run right to the point of connection where the old master valve sat. In this scenario, we can just disconnect the two wires from that master valve and use them to install the FXT and wire up both the master valve and the flow sensor. Again, it's important to note that when not using the EXT, the FXT needs to be no more than 4,000 feet away from the CT or controller transceiver. So while most of the time our FlowLink installations will be on retrofit projects, it's important to understand that it can also be a very useful tool on new installations. Because of the 2,000-foot communication limit on PE39 or standard flow sensor cable, using a FlowLink can double the distance your flow sensor can sit from your controller. Also, because of the cost of the PE39 cable, it's sometimes cheaper to install a FlowLink even when they're under the 2,000-foot distance. I also encourage contractors to think of the FlowLink when troubleshooting flow sensors. If your existing flow sensor has issues with intermittent communication because of either distance from the controller or interference on the cable, adding a FlowLink will eliminate any such issues. So when you go to unwrap your new FlowLink, you'll see right off the bat we have our CT, or our controller transceiver, our FXT, or our field transceiver, and we can tell that this is a plus because we also have the EXT. In addition to the FlowLink hardware, you'll see that we have all of the DBRYs for all of the connections in the valve box, and mounting hardware to mount the device to the controller. Let's begin our wiring demonstrations with a quick example of how to wire an FXT. And as you can see in this wiring diagram, you'll wire your master valve and flow sensor to the FXT, and this will handle all of the operation and communication for both of these devices. Clearly, the most difficult part in doing a flow project is installing the master valve and flow sensor. So when you go to install the FXT, hopefully you'll have the master valve and flow sensor already installed. And inside the valve box, you'll have your master valve, your flow sensor, your FXT, and the two control wires. These two wires might be the hot and the common wire that you just disconnected from your master valve, or they could be the two wires that you're running across from your EXT, which we'll talk about in the upcoming segment. If the installation of your master valve and flow sensor require that the two devices are in separate valve boxes, you can easily extend the wires on the FXT by just adding a wire nut and enough irrigation wire to reach the other component. Either way, when all of these components are correctly installed, we're ready to wire them up. If you look closely at your FXT, you'll notice that there are three sets of wires. The blue wires in the middle will power up the unit, the white wires will work the master valve, and the red and black wires are for your flow sensor. So the first thing I do is I take my FXT and I wire up the power wires, one to the common and one to the hot. And when I'm using my DBRY wire connectors, I make sure that that wire gets pushed all the way to the top of the tube, and I make sure that the bottom is locked tight to seal out any water or other possible contaminants into those connections. If you promise to go back, sometimes it's a good idea to wait until the FlowLink is completely installed and your controller is reading flow and you've verified the installation before you put those gel caps on, because it's never fun to pull those connections out of the goo if you missed a connection. But for proper installation, by the end of the installation, every connection should be in a DBRY gel cap. Once I've got my power wires hooked up, I take the two white wires from the FXT and hook them to the two wires for the master valve. Again, using my DBRY wire connectors to seal out any water or other contaminants. And then I'm ready to wire up my flow sensor. Notice that the flow sensor wires have a black, a red, and a yellow. The yellow wire will only be used when wiring a photodiode flow sensor. So in this application with the T-style flow sensor, we'll just bend this yellow wire back and we'll simply connect the red wire on the flow sensor to the red wire on the FXT and the black wire on the flow sensor to the black wire on the FXT. And once I've got my red and black wires in the DBRY wire nuts, I've got my two master valve wires wired to the white leads, and I've got my two field wires or my power wires connected to the blue leads. Then my FXT is completely wired up and I'm ready to move to the next step of installation. Before we wrap up talking about the FXT, I want to do another quick example of installing an FXT, but this time using a WeatherTRAK Flow3 photodiode as my example. There are many different variations on master valve and flow sensor installations. The types of master valves change, the types of flow sensors change. In this case, we've got a master valve and flow sensor in one, and we've got an additional wrinkle of using a photodiode or an optical sensor that requires a power supply to accurately read the flow. So again, this is the second and final example of how to wire a WeatherTRAK FlowLink FXT. Alright, we call this the Flow3 because it's got three flow devices in one: the meter, the master valve, and the flow sensor. And again, we've got our FlowLink FXT that has three different sets of wires. The blue will be the power wires, the white will be the solenoid for the master valve, and the black, red, and yellow will be the flow sensor wires. So just like in the last example, our first step is to wire our two blue wires to the incoming power supply, making sure we use our DBY gel caps. Next, we'll take our two white wires from the FXT and wire them to the two black wires coming from the little black box that is the solenoid for the master valve on the Flow 3. And once we've pushed those wire nuts in all the way to the top of the gel cap, so the jelly fills the bottom of the wire nut and seals out all of the moisture, we're ready to wire in our flow sensor. And notice with the photodiode flow sensor, I've got 3 wires for the photodiode flow sensor: a bare copper, a translucent wire cover, and a yellow wire cover. Following the wire diagram, I know that the black wire goes to the bare copper, the red goes to the translucent wire, leaving us just the yellow wire from the photodiode and the yellow wire from the FXT. The yellow wire for the photodiode actually powers up the photocell that reads the flow sensor and delivers the flow information, and we need to power up that photocell to get it to read properly. For this, we'll need to strip the protective cover off of the yellow wire on the FXT, connect the 2 yellow wires, and protect them in a DBRY. Again, once you have the blue wires connected to the power supply wires coming from our EXT, our white wires connected to the black master valve solenoid wires, the red to the translucent, the black to the bare copper, and the yellow to the power wire or the yellow wire for the photodiode, our photodiode is completely wired up. Just remember that the photodiode is the only application where that yellow wire on the FXT is actually used. In all other applications, the yellow wire is just left sealed up and not connected to anything. If you're borrowing the wires from a station valve in the field, you'll need to move on to your EXT. And without a doubt, the hardest part of installing the EXT is digging the trench from the existing valve over to where you're installing your master valve and flow sensor. But once you've completed digging that trench, installing the EXT is very easy. The first thing you do when installing your EXT is disconnect the valve wires in your valve box from the hot wire and the common wire that are leading into that valve. Then you'll have 2 power wires coming from the controller that used to power that valve. You'll have the 2 wires that you've just trenched over to where you're installing your FXT, and you'll have the 2 wires coming from the solenoid off of your valve. Then we bring in our EXT, and first thing we do is we take the 2 white wires and we connect them to the 2 valve wires that replaces the operation to this valve solenoid. Once we've completed that, we take the 2 blue wires, we take the hot wire, 1 blue wire, and 1 of the wires that leads off to the FXT, and put them all together in 1 wire nut. One of the most frequently asked questions about installing a FlowLink is what type of wire we need to connect the FXT and the EXT. While we recommend standard 14 gauge irrigation wire, certainly the color you use does not make any impact on the installation. Because the blue wires on the EXT and the blue wires on the FXT are not polarized, it doesn't matter which blue wire on the FXT we connect to which blue wire on the EXT. So you can wire them in any order and with any color you like, and certainly we don't need the shielded flow wire that we use to directly install flow sensors back to controllers. The FlowLink protects you from the same signal interference that shielded wire will protect you from on a direct installation. Then we take the common wire, the other wire leading to the FXT, and the other blue wire and put them in another wire nut. And once we put all these connections into the DBRY gel caps, that's all there is to installing an EXT. Also available in the Flow Solutions Guide are alternative EXT wiring diagrams that detail how to capture that valve wire in the middle of the wire run rather than in the valve box. So if the valve wire runs right by where you want to install, or you have other site challenges that might make it easier to capture the wire in the middle of the run rather than in the valve box, check the Flow Solutions Guide for a wiring diagram. And after you've successfully completed the installation of the FXT and the EXT, all that's left on the FlowLink installation is the installation of the CT or controller transceiver. The first step in installing the CT is to mount the unit close enough to the controller that the wires can extend to the valve wire terminal ports that they need to be connected to. If you've got a wall mount controller inside the box, there's enough mounting hardware to mount the box right next to the controller and extend the wires up through the bottom of the controller. Inside a pedestal mount controller, I often see two-sided tape or Velcro to strategically position the CT inside of the pedestal in a position where the CT wires can be extended to the necessary valve wire terminal ports. As I'm sure by now you've come to expect, in the Flow Solutions Guide there is a wiring diagram for the CT that does a great job outlining where each wire from the CT gets plugged into the board or attached in the controller. And in addition to that wiring diagram, there's wiring directions right here on the front faceplate of the CT, where it spells out exactly how each wire on the CT should be connected. To begin our CT installation demo, we see that we've mounted the CT box in a place that can easily reach the controller and easily facilitate all of the wiring that needs to happen inside the controller. Now we see all of these wires that need to get wired in, and we look to our wiring solution, and the first thing we see we need to identify is the station valve, or the station that we've borrowed our field wire from. Let's say, for example, we've borrowed station 6. So the first thing I do is go and I pull out the field wire for station 6. And according to my wiring chart, I'm going to plug in the white wire from the controller transceiver into the station terminal for station 6. The second wire I'm going to install is the MV, or master valve wire, which I can see is the blue wire on my controller transceiver, and I'll plug that into the MV, or master valve port. Next one I want to plug in is my FL, or flow wire, and we can see that that's the red wire, and that goes into my FL positive, or my flow positive port. Then I'm ready for my VC, or my valve common, and I need the black wire for that. And that'll either go into my FL negative, or my black valve wire port, or any port on the board marked VC, or valve common. The next wire is labeled line. This is the wire that we just pulled out of our station wire terminal port. So we take our station wire and we connect our green wire from our CT to our station wire using a standard wire nut. And then we leave that connection, wire nut and all, in the controller. And the last thing we need to do is power up the unit. Now it's very important that this is done last. So important that you'll notice that here on the orange wire it says 24 volts AC, do not connect until the FlowLink FT is installed. Installing and powering up the CT in the wrong sequence can cause irreparable damage to the FlowLink components and is not covered under warranty. So it's very important that we wait until all of the other FlowLink components are installed before we go to power up the unit. And when we're ready to do that, we'll take the orange wire and plug it into the first terminal, or the leftmost red port on your rain sensor adapter, where the FlowLink will receive 24 volts AC directly from the transformer and power up all of the FlowLink components in the field. And now that you've completed the wiring installation, you can start to use one of the key features of the FlowLink, the LED diagnostics. As you can see on the CT, before you add power, none of the LED diagnostics are illuminated. But as soon as you plug in the orange wire, you see the power and activity LED illuminate on the CT. And this is a key piece of troubleshooting information. For the first 10 seconds, the FlowLink runs a diagnostic and tries to connect the CT to the FXT and the EXT. So you'll see the power and activity LED flicker for the first 10 seconds. After the connection is made, however, that LED should illuminate a solid light, only flickering once every 10 or so seconds to verify the communication. If the constant flickering continues, that usually means we're not powering the devices in the field, and likely you've used the wrong field wire, or you've chosen a field wire that has a break in it to try and run your FlowLink circuit. So once you've got a solid illumination from your power LED, the next test is to turn on your master valve and check to see that the master valve activity light illuminates. Note that anytime the controller is activating the master valve, this light will be illuminated. So it's important for you as a manager to know whether you have a normally open or normally closed master valve to know when that light should be illuminated during normal management. And once you've validated your master valve activity light, the last CT LED diagnostic that you want to check is your station activity light. To do this, we turn on the station valve that we've connected to our EXT and make sure that the ST light, or station LED, comes on our CT. Once you've validated all of the LED diagnostics at the CT, the next step is to go check your LED diagnostics at your EXT. If everything is already powered up at the CT, by the time you open the valve box, you'll see the blue power LED illuminated on the EXT, confirming the connection in the network. Then you can use your WeatherTRAK mobile to turn on that station, which should illuminate the green activity light for the valve function, as well as activate the valve. Finally, you're ready to check the LED diagnostics at the FXT. Again, when you open the valve box, the power LED will already be illuminated. Then you can use your WeatherTRAK mobile to turn on a station, and as soon as the controller tries to activate the master valve, you'll see the green LED turn on for the master valve. Then when water starts moving through the pipe and the flow sensor starts collecting flow data, you'll see the white LED diagnostic confirming the function of the flow sensor. Finally, let's wrap this training up with a few keys to success when installing and using FlowLink. First of all, I can't overstate the value of the Flow Solutions Guide and the use of the wiring diagrams provided in that document, both when installing and troubleshooting the FlowLink device. Also remember that there's two different versions, one that has the EXT and one that doesn't. If you already have master valve wires or other wires that run to where you want to install the flow sensor and master valve setup, you won't need that EXT. It's hugely important to remember to plug in that orange wire as the last step. Do not power the device until everything is installed. And last but not least, remember that those LED indicator lights are a very powerful tool that can help verify the installation as well as verify the function of the system when you're troubleshooting. So look for those power and activity lights as great tools to use throughout the time you spend managing this FlowLink.